10 years before the day that would decide the fate of Greece, an Athenian messenger ran 26 miles through the dust and heat to bring news that should have been impossible. The Persians had landed at Marathon. The Persians had formed their lines. The Persians had been beaten. The greatest empire the world had ever known, stretching from the Indus to the Mediterranean, had sent an expeditionary force to punish Athens for its insolence. That force had been shattered on the plain of Marathon by Greek spearmen fighting on their own soil. The Battle of Marathon in 490 BC was not merely a military defeat for Persia, it was a humiliation that echoed through the halls of power in Susa and Persepolis. The great King Darius, ruler of millions, had been defied by a collection of Greek city-states whose combined population would not fill a single Persian province. His soldiers, who had conquered Babylon and Egypt, had fled before farmers and merchants fighting in bronze armor. The dead had been left on foreign soil. The ships had sailed home carrying shame. For the Greeks, Marathon was proof that the Persians could be beaten. The hoplite phalanx, that wall of bronze shields and iron spears, had proven superior to Persian tactics. Greek discipline had overcome Persian numbers. The victory entered Greek consciousness as a defining moment, a demonstration that free men defending their homes could defeat the armies of tyrants. Athens in particular drew strength from Marathon. The city grew more confident, more assertive, more willing to challenge Persian influence in the Aegean. But Darius did not forget. Empires do not absorb humiliation quietly. Plans were made for a second expedition, larger and more thorough. This would not be a punitive raid, it would be a conquest. Greece would be brought into the Persian fold, its cities occupied, its people made subjects of the great king. But Darius died before the plans could be executed, and the task fell to his son. Xerxes inherited his father's throne and his father's anger. He was young, ambitious, and determined to succeed where Darius had failed. For years the Persian Empire mobilized. Soldiers were gathered from every province. Ships were built in Phoenicia and Egypt. Supply depots were established along the route to Greece. A bridge of boats was constructed across the Hellespont, that narrow strait separating Asia from Europe, so that the Persian army could march directly into Greece rather than risk the sea crossing that had endangered the first expedition. The scale of the preparation was unprecedented. Ancient sources, prone to exaggeration, speak of millions of soldiers. Modern estimates are more conservative, but even the most cautious scholars place Xerxes' army at several 100,000 men, with a fleet of perhaps 600 to 1,000 warships. It was the largest military force ever assembled in the ancient Mediterranean, a tide of humanity and steel moving inexorably westward. The Greeks knew it was coming. Reports filtered through from spies and travelers. The bridge across the Hellespont was common knowledge. The gathering of supplies and troops could not be hidden. As 480 BC dawned, Greece understood that it faced an existential threat. This would not be another Marathon, a single battle on favorable ground. This would be an invasion, and the Persians would not make the same mistakes twice. The burning world. In the summer of 480 BC, the Persian army crossed into Europe. The march south was methodical and overwhelming. Cities that resisted were destroyed. Cities that submitted were incorporated into the Persian supply network. Most chose submission. The memory of what Persia did to rebels was long and bloody. Earth and water, the tokens of submission to the great king, were offered by city after city as the army approached. The Greek states formed a defensive alliance, led nominally by Sparta, but with substantial Athenian participation. The adi-do strategy was to delay the Persian advance at narrow points where numbers would matter less. The first stand was made at Thermopylae, that narrow pass between mountain and sea, where a small force could theoretically hold a large army indefinitely. King Leonidas of Sparta took 300 Spartan warriors to Thermopylae, along with several thousand allies from other Greek states. For 3 days they held the pass. The Persians threw regiment after regiment against the Greek position and were thrown back. The narrow confines negated the Persian advantage in numbers. The superior armor and training of the Greek hoplites, particularly the Spartans, turned the pass into a killing ground. But on the 3rd day, betrayal turned the tide. A Greek traitor showed the Persians a mountain path that bypassed the pass. Leonidas, learning that his position was about to be surrounded, dismissed most of his allies. The Spartans remained, along with a few hundred Thespians and Thebans who refused to abandon them. They made their last stand on a small hillock within the pass. They fought with spears until the spears broke, with swords until the swords shattered, and finally with hands and teeth until none remained alive. Thermopylae was a tactical defeat, but a moral victory. The Greeks had proven again that they could hurt the Persians. The 300 became legend before their bodies cooled. But the pass was lost, and the road to Athens lay open. The Athenians evacuated their city. Women, children, and the elderly were sent to Troezen and Aegina. The men took to their ships, for Athens' real strength was not its walls, but its navy. The Persians entered an empty city and burned it. The temples on the Acropolis, the sacred heart of Athens, were put to the torch in deliberate retribution for Greek destruction of Persian temples during the Ionian Revolt years earlier. The smoke could be seen for miles. Athens, the city that had won at Marathon, was now a ruin. But the Greek navy, under Athenian leadership, won a stunning victory at Salamis. In the narrow straits near the burned city, the Greek triremes outmaneuvered and destroyed a large portion of the Persian fleet. Xerxes, watching from a throne on the shore, saw his navy shattered. He had expected to witness a triumph. Instead, he witnessed disaster. The naval defeat changed everything. Without naval superiority, the Persian army could not be supplied adequately for a winter campaign in hostile territory. The route back to Asia might be cut if the Greeks sailed to the Hellespont and destroyed the bridge. Xerxes made the decision to withdraw with most of his army, leaving behind a substantial force under his general Mardonius to complete the conquest the following year. The general and his army Mardonius was not like Xerxes. The great king was a monarch born to power, a man who commanded because of his lineage. Mardonius was a professional, a soldier who had risen through competence and success. He was Xerxes' brother-in-law, tied to the royal family through marriage, but he was also a man who understood warfare at a practical level. He had campaigned in Thrace and Macedonia. He had studied Greek tactics. He knew what had gone wrong at Marathon and Salamis, and he believed he could succeed where others had failed. The army Xerxes left under Mardonius's command was not the entire invasion force, but it was still formidable. Estimates vary, but a reasonable figure is perhaps 70,000 to 100,000 men. This included the best troops Persia could field, the immortals, the elite infantry of the Persian Empire, the Median cavalry, among the finest horsemen in the world, and contingents from across the empire, each bringing their own weapons and fighting styles. Critically, Mardonius had learned from Persian failures. He understood that Greek hoplites were superior in close combat on favorable terrain. He also understood that Persian strengths lay in mobility and ranged combat. His cavalry could harass Greek formations and disrupt supply lines. His archers could pour volleys into massed infantry from a distance. What he needed was to force the Greeks to fight on open ground where these advantages would matter, or to avoid fighting them directly, and instead break their alliance through diplomacy and economic pressure. Through the winter of 480 to 479 BC, Mardonius remained in Greece, primarily in Thessaly and Boeotia, regions that had submitted to Persian authority. He used this time to rebuild his supply network, to drill his troops, and to attempt to split the Greek alliance. He sent envoys to Athens offering remarkably generous terms. Athens would be rebuilt at Persian expense, its territory expanded, and it would become an honored ally of the great king rather than a conquered subject. All Athens had to do was abandon Sparta and the other Greeks. The offer was attractive. Athens lay in ruins. Its people were scattered. The Spartans, safe behind their fortifications in the Peloponnese, seemed reluctant to commit to another major campaign. Why not accept Persian friendship, especially on such favorable terms? The Athenian assembly debated. Some were tempted, but in the end, the memory of Marathon and Salamis prevailed. Athens rejected the offer. This rejection terrified Sparta. If Athens had accepted, the war would have been lost. The Athenian navy, the largest in Greece, would have been turned against the Peloponnese. Persian gold and Athenian ships would have isolated Sparta. The Helots, always restless, would have sensed weakness and risen in revolt. Everything Sparta had built over centuries would have collapsed. The Spartans understood they had no choice. They had to march north. They had to meet Mardonius in open battle. They had to destroy the Persian army decisively enough that the invasion would not be renewed. And they had to do it before Athens changed its mind or before internal dissent fractured the Greek alliance. Part 2. Why Sparta marched the debt of Thermopylae. Thermopylae hung over Sparta like a storm cloud. The 300 had died, but their death had been glorious. They had held the pass for 3 days against impossible odds. They had killed thousands of Persians. They had made Xerxes himself afraid. Their sacrifice had bought time for the Greek fleet to position itself for Salamis. They had proven that Spartan training, Spartan discipline, and Spartan courage were real, not mythology. But they had also died. The Spartans did not mourn as other Greeks mourned. There were no public displays of grief, no wailing in the streets. Spartan mothers were expected to tell their sons to return with their shields or on them. Spartan culture glorified death in battle as the highest achievement. Yet even within this hard culture, Thermopylae left a mark. The 300 had been an advance force, a delaying action, while the main Spartan army was supposedly delayed by religious festivals. Some historians suspect that Sparta had been hedging its bets, sending enough men to fulfill obligations without committing the full army to what might be a lost cause. Whether this cynical interpretation is true or not, the result was the same. The full Spartan army had not been there. Leonidas and his men had died, and the rest of Sparta had lived. Honor demanded a response. The Spartan system produced men obsessed with reputation and glory. To be thought cowardly was worse than death. To fail to avenge fallen comrades was to dishonor their sacrifice. Thermopylae had created a debt that could only be paid in Persian blood. Moreover, Sparta's entire identity was at stake. The city-state had built its reputation on military supremacy. For centuries, other Greeks had feared and respected Spartan arms. The agoge system, the brutality of training, the Helot oppression, all of it was justified by the claim that Sparta produced the finest warriors in Greece. If that claim was shown to be false, if the Spartans were revealed as ordinary men who could be defeated or intimidated, the entire structure would be at risk. The Helots were always watching. They outnumbered the Spartans by perhaps 7-1. They worked the fields that fed Sparta. They carried the supplies that supported Spartan armies. They endured systematic brutality, ritual murder, and constant humiliation. They stayed subdued because they believed the Spartans were invincible, that resistance was futile. If that belief cracked, if the Helots began to think the Spartans could be beaten, Messenia would rise again, as it had during the great Helot revolts. Sparta would be fighting for its life on its own soil, rather than on Greek battlefields. So Sparta had to fight. It had to win. and it had to win decisively enough that no one, Greek or barbarian, helot or ally, would question Spartan supremacy again. The political calculation. The winter of 484-79 BC was tense in Sparta. The ephors, the 5 magistrates who wielded enormous power in the Spartan constitution, debated strategy with the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, and with the 2 kings. The question was not whether to fight, but when and how. Sparta's natural instinct was caution. The city had survived for centuries by being conservative, by avoiding unnecessary risks, by focusing on internal security rather than external adventure. The Peloponnesian League, Sparta's alliance system, was designed primarily to protect Spartan territory, not to project power across Greece. The Spartans were reluctant imperialists who preferred to let other cities manage their own affairs as long as they provided troops when needed. But Mardonius's presence in central Greece changed the calculation. As long as a Persian army occupied Greek territory, as long as the threat of renewed invasion existed, Sparta could not be secure. The alliance with Athens might dissolve if Sparta appeared unwilling to fight. Other Peloponnesian states might begin to question whether Spartan leadership was worth the cost if Sparta would not defend Greek interests beyond its own borders. There was also the matter of reputation among the Greeks themselves. Athens had fought at Marathon without Spartan help, much to Sparta's embarrassment. The Athenians had provided the decisive naval victory at Salamis. If Athens now bore the burden of defeating Mardonius on land as well, Sparta's claim to military leadership would be hollow. The Athenians were already arrogant. They did not need additional reasons to question Spartan primacy. The ephors sent messages to the Athenian leadership. Sparta would march. The full army would mobilize. The Spartiates, the citizen soldiers, would go to war supported by the perioikoi and even helots serving as light infantry. This was not a token force. This was the entire military might of Lacedaemon, something that had not been deployed in living memory. The decision was formalized in the spring of 479 BC. Pausanias, the regent serving on behalf of the young king Pleistarchus, would command. Pausanias was in his 30s, relatively young for such responsibility, but he was of royal blood and had proven himself capable. He was also perhaps less bound by the extreme conservatism of the older generation. He understood that this battle would determine Sparta's future. The mobilization orders went out. Across Laconia and Messenia, men prepared for war. The Spartiates assembled in their syssitia, their mess groups, to make final preparations. Armor was polished, spears were sharpened. The red cloaks, the distinctive phoenixes that marked Spartan warriors, were donned. The helots who would accompany the army as servants and light troops were assembled and given their orders. The perioikoi, the free but non-citizen inhabitants of Laconia, formed their own units to march alongside the Spartans. In early summer, the army moved north. It was not a hasty march. Spartan armies moved with deliberation, maintaining formation even on the march. This was not just military discipline, it was psychological warfare. A Spartan army on the march was a statement. We are coming, we are organized, and you should be afraid. As the Spartans crossed into the territory of their Peloponnesian allies, other contingents joined them. The Tegeans, longtime allies, contributed their hoplites. The Corinthians, powerful and wealthy, sent a substantial force. Smaller cities, some enthusiastically and some under pressure, added their warriors to the growing host. By the time the army reached the Isthmus of Corinth, the narrow land bridge connecting the Peloponnese to central Greece, it numbered tens of thousands. The Athenians, who had been waiting anxiously, saw the Spartan army approach and understood that the moment had come. The alliance would hold, the battle would be fought, and Greece would be defended not by Athenians alone or Spartans alone, but by Greeks united against the invader. Part 3. The armies gather. The Persian confidence. Mardonius had spent the winter wisely. His army was not the massive host that Xerxes had led into Greece the previous year, but it was still formidable, and, more importantly, it was professional. He had kept the best troops and sent the rest home. What remained was a force of veteran soldiers who understood their craft, supported by cavalry and archers who could exploit Greek weaknesses. The Persian camp was established in Boeotia, the region north of Athens. The city of Thebes had submitted to Persian authority, and the Thebans were providing logistical support. This gave Mardonius a secure base with access to supplies and intelligence about Greek movements. The Boeotian plain, relatively flat and open, was ideal terrain for cavalry. If the Greeks could be drawn into battle there, Persian mobility would be decisive. Mardonius's infantry corps consisted of the immortals, so called because their number was always maintained, at exactly 10,000. When one fell in battle or to disease, another immediately took his place, ensuring that the unit never appeared diminished. These were not conscripts or provincial levies. They were career soldiers, well-equipped and thoroughly trained. They wore scale armor or reinforced linen corselets, carried short spears and swords, and fought behind large wicker shields that could be planted in the ground to create a defensive wall. The immortals were formidable, but they were not hoplites. Their armor was lighter. Their shields, while large, were not the heavy bronze aspis carried by Greek warriors. Their spears were shorter, designed for thrusting at close range, but not for the initial shock of a phalanx charge. They were trained to fight flexibly, to maneuver and adapt, to use combined arms tactics with archers and cavalry. This made them effective in many contexts, but it also meant they were vulnerable in a straight push of shields contest against heavily armored Greek infantry. Beyond the immortals, Mardonius had troops from across the Persian Empire, Medes and Bactrians, renowned for their cavalry, Egyptians and Phoenicians, though most of the naval forces had withdrawn with Xerxes, Central Asian horse archers, men who could ride at full gallop while putting arrows through gaps in armor. This diversity was both strength and weakness. The army could employ multiple tactics and adapt to different situations, but it also required careful coordination and command. The troops spoke different languages, followed different customs, and had varying levels of commitment to the Persian cause. The cavalry was Mardonius's most potent weapon. Greek city-states, with few exceptions, did not emphasize cavalry. The terrain of Greece, mountainous and broken, did not favor horsemen. Greek warfare was dominated by hoplite infantry. This meant that Persian cavalry had a significant advantage in mobility and in their ability to harass and disrupt. A cavalry force could intercept supply columns, cut off water sources, and attack scattered or disorganized infantry before they could form up. Used properly, cavalry could negate the Greek advantages in armor and close combat. Mardonius understood all of this. His plan was to avoid a direct confrontation if possible. He would use his cavalry to pressure the Greeks, to disrupt their logistics, to create frustration and fear. He would offer continued diplomatic overtures, attempting to split the alliance, and if battle became necessary, he would force it to occur on terrain that favored Persian strengths. The Persian soldiers themselves were confident. They had seen the size of Xerxes's army. They had marched through Greece with minimal resistance. Athens had burned. Thermopylae, while costly, had ultimately been a victory. The Greeks seemed divided and weak. Their cities submitted or fled. The idea that these scattered city-states could stand against the Persian Empire seemed absurd. The Enos Greek coalition, the Greek army that assembled in response to the Persian threat, was a coalition, not a unified force. It was composed of contingents from dozens of city-states, each with its own commanders, its own standards, and its own interests. Holding such a force together required constant diplomacy and careful management of pride and precedent. The overall command was given to Pausanias of Sparta. This was partly recognition of Spartan military prestige and partly political necessity. The Spartans would only march under their own leadership. Other states accepted this because they feared Sparta almost as much as they feared Persia, and because Spartan military skill was undeniable. The Spartan contingent was the heart of the army. 5,000 Spartiates, the full citizen levy, formed the elite corps. This was an extraordinary commitment. Sparta's total citizen population was perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 adult males at this time. Sending 5,000 to war meant leaving Laconia dangerously exposed. It demonstrated how seriously Sparta took this threat. Each Spartiate was accompanied by 7 helots serving as light infantry. These helots were armed with javelins, slings, or bows. They were not expected to fight in the phalanx, that was the privilege and burden of citizens, but they could harass enemy skirmishers, protect the flanks, and support the main line. This brought the total Lacedaemonian force to 40,000 men. The Tegeans contributed 5,000 hoplites. Tegea was Sparta's oldest and most reliable ally in the Peloponnese. The Tegean hoplites were well-trained and experienced. They would fight on the Spartan right wing, the position of honor in Greek battle formations, sharing the critical point of contact with the enemy. The Athenians provided 8,000 hoplites. This was not their full strength. Maintaining the fleet required manpower, and Athens had to garrison its rebuilt fortifications. But 8,000 was substantial, and the Athenian hoplites were veterans. Many had fought at Marathon. They understood what they were facing. Smaller contingents came from Corinth, Megara, Sicyon, Epidaurus, Troezen, and other Peloponnesian cities. The island of Aegina sent 500. Even Plataea, the small Boeotian city that had supported Athens at Marathon, sent 600 men despite being surrounded by Persian-friendly territory. In total, the Greek army numbered perhaps 35,000 to 40,000 hoplites, with additional light infantry bringing the total to something over 70,000. This was an impressive force by Greek standards, but it was heterogeneous. The Spartans fought in the Lacedaemonian style, with maximum depth and cohesion. The Athenians had their own traditions and tactics. The smaller contingents varied in quality. Coordinating this mass, ensuring that orders were understood and executed, would be a constant challenge. The Greek army also had a critical weakness: light cavalry. The Greeks had almost none. A few hundred horsemen from Athens and some Boeotian states, but nothing comparable to the Persian mounted forces. This meant the Greeks would be vulnerable to harassment and would struggle to pursue a broken enemy. It also meant they would have difficulty scouting and gathering intelligence. The Persians would have better information about Greek movements than the Greeks would have about Persian dispositions. But the Greeks had advantages that numbers did not capture. Their hoplites were the best heavy infantry in the Mediterranean. The panoply, the full armor of a Greek warrior, included a bronze helmet, breastplate, and greaves, along with the distinctive aspis shield. This equipment was heavy, perhaps 70 pounds in total, and expensive. Not every man could afford it, which is why hoplite warfare was associated with the middle and upper classes. But those who could afford it became walking fortresses. The aspis was the key to hoplite effectiveness. It was large, covering from chin to knee, and made of wood covered with bronze. It was held by inserting the left arm through a central band and gripping a handle at the rim. This meant each man's shield protected his own left side and the right side of the man next to him. To run was to expose your comrade to attack. This created immense social pressure to hold formation. The primary weapon was the dory, a spear approximately 8 to 10 feet long with a bronze head and a bronze spike on the butt. The spear was held overhand or underhand depending on the situation, used for thrusting rather than throwing. If the spear broke, and it often did in the crush of combat, the hoplite would draw his sword, typically a short xiphus or the longer kopis, and continue fighting. But the real strength of the hoplites was not their equipment. It was their training and discipline. The Spartans in particular had spent their entire lives preparing for this moment. From age 7, they had been trained to march in formation, to hold position under pressure, to obey orders without question. They had been conditioned to prefer death to dishonor. They had been shaped into components of a machine. The other Greek hoplites, while not as extensively trained, still understood the phalanx. They had practiced with their fellow citizens. They had learned to keep step, to maintain intervals, to move as a unit. In the phalanx, individual skill mattered less than collective cohesion. A single warrior, no matter how brave or strong, would be overwhelmed. But a formation of warriors, shields locked and spears leveled, was nearly unstoppable. This was the fundamental tactical reality of the coming battle. The Persians had numbers, mobility, and ranged weapons. The Greeks had armor, discipline, and the devastating shock power of the phalanx charge. The battle would be decided by which force could impose its strengths on the other. Part 4. Days of tension. The waiting, the Greek army marched north from the isthmus in late summer. The heat was oppressive. Dust rose from thousands of marching feet, coating everything in a fine grit that worked its way into mouths and eyes and armor joints. The hoplites marched in formation, maintaining their units even on the move. This slowed the advance, but ensured that if they encountered the enemy, they would be ready to fight immediately, rather than having to spend time organizing scattered troops. As they entered Boeotia, the Greeks learned that Mardonius had withdrawn from Thebes and was establishing positions on the northern bank of the Asopus River, near the town of Plataea. This was strategically sound. The river provided a natural defensive barrier. The plains to the north were ideal for cavalry operations, and Mardonius would have the high ground, able to observe Greek movements while protecting his own camp. Pausanias led the Greek army to the southern foothills of Mount Cithaeron, the mountain range that divided Boeotia from Attica. Here the Greeks established their own positions on rising ground that overlooked the plain. The terrain was broken and rocky, not ideal for cavalry. This was deliberate. Pausanias understood that the Greeks could not contest the open plain. They needed to fight on ground where their strengths would matter. For several days, the two armies watched each other across the intervening distance. Neither commander was willing to make the first move. Mardonius wanted the Greeks to come down to the plain where his cavalry could attack them. Pausanias wanted the Persians to attack uphill where the terrain would negate their mobility. It was a strategic stalemate, each side waiting for the other to make a mistake. The waiting was its own form of warfare. Soldiers sat in armor under the summer sun, sweat running freely, muscles aching from the weight of bronze. Water had to be rationed. Food supplies had to be managed carefully. Disease was always a concern when thousands of men camped in close proximity. Tension built as day followed day with no resolution. Mardonius understood that time was on his side. The Greek alliance was fragile. The longer the army sat idle, the more likely it was that some contingent would lose patience and leave. Political pressures at home might force states to withdraw their troops. Supplies might run short, and the longer the Greeks remained in his territory, the more vulnerable their supply lines became. The Persian general decided to test Greek resolve with harassment. He sent his cavalry across the river to probe the Greek positions. These were not full-scale attacks, merely raids designed to inflict casualties, disrupt rest, and demonstrate Persian mobility. The cavalry raids. The first cavalry raid came at dawn. The Greeks, still establishing their camp, saw a cloud of dust approaching from across the plain. The dust resolved into horsemen, hundreds of them, moving at speed. The Persian cavalry swept toward the Greek left wing, where the Athenians and Megarians were positioned. The horsemen did not charge home into the Greek formations. That would have been suicide. Horses will not run onto a wall of spears, and cavalry, charging into a prepared phalanx, would simply impale themselves. Instead, the riders circled at just outside spear range, loosing arrows and javelins into the packed ranks of hoplites before wheeling away and repeating the process. This was frustrating and dangerous. The Greeks, trained for close combat, could do nothing but endure. They raised their shields to cover themselves, forming a testudo-like shell. Arrows thudded into bronze and wood. Most were deflected by armor or shields, but some found gaps. Men cried out as arrowheads pierced throats or groins or the backs of knees. The wounded were dragged back, and their positions filled by others stepping forward. The Athenians had their own archers, and these returned fire. But the Persian horsemen were moving targets, difficult to hit. The exchange was unequal. The Greeks took casualties while inflicting few in return. After perhaps an hour of this harassment, the cavalry withdrew as suddenly as they had appeared, disappearing back across the plain toward the Persian lines. Pausanias surveyed the damage. Perhaps 50 or 100 men were dead or wounded, a small fraction of his army, but enough to be concerning. More importantly, the raid had demonstrated Greek vulnerability. As long as the Persians controlled the open ground, they could harass the Greeks at will. If this continued, the casualties would accumulate, and Greek morale would suffer. The next day brought more raids. This time the cavalry targeted the Greek center, where contingents from smaller cities were positioned. Again the pattern repeated. Approach, circle, fire, withdraw. Again the Greeks could only endure. Their hoplite panoply, designed to stop spears and swords, was less effective against arrows fired from a distance. The geidoi, flat bronze surfaces of shields, could deflect arrows striking head-on, but arrows coming at an angle could slip past shields or find the gaps between armor plates. On the third day, the Persians grew bolder. A large cavalry force, perhaps 2,000 strong, approached the Greek positions and this time threatened to charge. The Greeks formed their phalanxes, locking shields and lowering spears. The front ranks planted the butts of their spears in the ground, creating a hedge of bronze points. The horsemen, seeing the wall of spears, circled instead of charging, continuing the harassment with missiles. But one group of Persian cavalry became isolated. They had pushed too close to the Greek lines and found themselves cut off when the terrain forced them into a narrow defile. A detachment of Athenian hoplites, supported by light infantry, counterattacked. The cavalry tried to disengage, but the broken ground slowed them. Some horses stumbled. Riders were pulled from their saddles and killed on the ground. Among the slain was a Persian nobleman named Mecistius, the cavalry commander. He was a figure of importance, recognizable by his gilded armor and fine horse. His death sent a shock through the Persian ranks. The cavalry retreated in disorder, abandoning the field to recover the body. The Athenians, realizing they had killed someone significant, paraded the corpse through their ranks as a trophy. The Greeks cheered. They had drawn blood. They had proven that the Persians were not invincible. Morale, which had been sagging under the constant harassment, surged. Songs were sung. Men joked and laughed for the first time in days. The psychological impact of this small victory was disproportionate to its military significance. But Mardonius was not deterred. He increased the cavalry raids, targeting Greek supply lines. Persian horsemen swept around the Greek flanks, intercepting supply wagons bringing food from the Peloponnese. They killed the drivers, scattered the oxen, and burned the supplies. The Greeks, who had been relying on a steady stream of provisions, suddenly faced shortages. Water became a critical issue. The Greeks were camped in the foothills, and their primary water source was the Gargaphia Spring, a small but reliable flow. Without it, they would have to carry water from greater distances or descend to the river, exposing themselves to cavalry attack. Pausanias placed guards around the spring, but it was vulnerable. The breaking point. On the 11th day of the standoff, Mardonius made his decisive move. He sent a strong cavalry force to attack the Gargaphia Spring directly. The guards fought bravely, but were overwhelmed. The Persians did not try to hold the spring. They destroyed it. Horses trampled the ground around the source. Riders dug trenches to divert the flow. Debris was thrown into the water to foul it. Within hours, the spring that had sustained the entire Greek army was unusable. Pausanias received the report with grim recognition. The situation had become untenable. The army could not remain in position without water. Moving during daylight would expose the Greeks to cavalry attack, but staying would mean slow death from thirst and starvation. The breaking point continued. Pausanias called a council of war as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The commanders of each Greek contingent gathered in the Spartan sector of the camp, standing in a rough circle around the regent. Maps drawn on leather and wax tablets showed the terrain, the Persian positions, and the dwindling Greek options. The situation was presented without embellishment. The Gargaphia Spring was destroyed. The supply wagons from the south had been intercepted for 3 consecutive days. The army had perhaps 2 days of water remaining in its stores, less if they continued to ration as strictly as they had been. Food was running low. Morale, temporarily boosted by the death of Mecistius, was declining, again as men grew hungry and thirsty. Several commanders argued for immediate withdrawal. They could retreat south under cover of darkness, back across the passes of Cithaeron to more defensible ground closer to the Peloponnese. This would preserve the army and force the Persians to either follow into disadvantageous terrain or abandon the pursuit. It was the safe choice, the logical choice, but Pausanias understood what retreat would mean politically. The alliance would fragment, states would question Spartan leadership. Athens, which had risked everything by rejecting Persian offers, would feel betrayed. The propaganda value to Persia would be enormous. The Greeks had assembled their largest army and then run away without fighting. Future resistance would become impossible. Every Greek city would sue for peace on whatever terms they could get. Moreover, a retreat under pressure was militarily dangerous. The army would have to move in darkness through difficult terrain while being harried by Persian cavalry. Formations would break up, stragglers would be picked off. The withdrawal could easily turn into a rout, and if the Greeks were caught in the open, fragmented and disorganized, the Persians would slaughter them. The regent made his decision. The army would reposition, but not retreat. They would move at night to a new position called the island, a piece of ground between 2 streams closer to Plataea itself. This position would have access to water from the streams and would still be on broken ground unfavorable to cavalry. It was a lateral movement rather than a withdrawal, a tactical adjustment rather than strategic defeat. The orders were disseminated through the various contingents. The movement would begin at the second watch of the night, after the moon had risen but before dawn. Each unit would move in sequence, maintaining as much organization as possible in the darkness. The Spartans would hold their position until the rest of the army had withdrawn, serving as a rear guard. As night fell over the plain of Plataea, the Greek camp grew quiet. Men checked their equipment, tightening straps and securing armor that would need to move silently. Officers whispered final instructions. The tension was palpable. Everyone understood that the next few hours would be critical. If the Persians detected the movement and attacked during the withdrawal, disaster would follow. The night movement. The moon rose over Mount Cithaeron, casting pale light across the plain. In the Greek camp, the first units began to move. The contingents from the smaller cities went first, filing out of their positions and making their way south and west toward the new position. They moved quietly, but thousands of armed men cannot move in complete silence. Armor clinked, feet shuffled on rocky ground. Whispered commands passed down the lines. The movement should have been coordinated and orderly. It was not. In the darkness and confusion, some units moved too quickly. Others hesitated, uncertain of the route. The careful plan began to unravel almost immediately. Units that were supposed to move in sequence became intermingled. Men lost sight of their officers. The column stretched and fragmented. The Megarians and Phliasians, positioned in the center, misunderstood their orders, or perhaps panicked at the thought of being caught exposed. Instead of stopping at the island as planned, they continued moving south, past the designated position, heading back toward the town of Plataea itself. Other units, seeing this movement and fearing they were being left behind, followed. By midnight, nearly half the Greek army had moved to positions far behind where Pausanias had intended. They were scattered around Plataea and the lower slopes of Cithaeron, no longer in combat formation, no longer easily able to support each other. The carefully planned repositioning had become a confused and potentially disastrous retreat. On the right wing, where the Spartans and Tegeans held position, the situation was equally problematic, but for different reasons. Pausanias had ordered the Spartan contingent to wait until the rest of the army had withdrawn, then to move as the rear guard. But as the hours passed and reports came in about the disorganization of the withdrawal, it became clear that the original plan was falling apart. The Spartan commander of the Locos of Pitana, a man named Amompharetus, refused to move at all. He was a veteran officer, respected and stubborn. When his orders came to begin the withdrawal, he called his men together and told them he would not retreat from barbarians. He would not bring shame on Sparta by running away. He picked up a large stone with both hands and threw it at Pausanias' feet, declaring that this was his vote not to flee. Pausanias found himself in an impossible situation. He could not force Amompharetus to obey without creating a scene that would demoralize the entire Spartan contingent. He could not leave Amompharetus and his men behind. They would be massacred when the Persians realized the Greek position had been abandoned, and he could not delay much longer. Dawn was approaching, and with it, the Persian cavalry would resume their patrols. For an hour, Pausanias argued with Amompharetus. He explained that this was not retreat, but tactical repositioning. He pointed out that the rest of the army had already moved. He appealed to military discipline and obedience to command. Amompharetus was unmoved. His men, standing in formation around him, remained silent, waiting for their commander's decision. Finally, with dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky, Pausanias made a gamble. He ordered the rest of the Spartan army to begin moving, leaving Amompharetus and his Locos behind. It was a calculated risk. Either Amompharetus would relent when he saw himself truly abandoned, or he would become a martyr whose death would at least serve to inspire the rest of the army. The Spartan column began to march. The Tegeans, confused but obedient, followed. They moved slowly, constantly looking back, expecting at any moment to see Amompharetus follow. The distance between the moving column and the stubborn Locos grew. 100 yards, 200, half a mile. Amompharetus watched his comrades disappear into the pre-dawn gloom. He looked at his own men, perhaps 300 Spartans who had followed him into this position and would follow him into death if he demanded it. And he understood that his pride had put them in an impossible situation. If he held his ground, they would all die when the Persians attacked. Their deaths would not be glorious. They would be pointless, the result of one man's stubbornness. He gave the order to move. The Locos broke formation and began to jog, not march, trying to catch up with the main Spartan force. The men were running in full armor, 70 pounds of bronze and iron, on rough ground, in the darkness, but they ran because the alternative was death. As the sky brightened from black to grey, the Spartan rearguard reunited with the main column. Pausanias said nothing to Amompharitus. There was no time for recriminations. The sun was rising, and they were still exposed on open ground, still separated from the rest of the Greek army, still vulnerable. And across the plain, Persian sentries were beginning to realize that the Greek camp was empty. Part 5. When the killing begins. The Persian advance. Mardonius received the reports as he broke his fast in his tent. The Greeks had withdrawn during the night. Their camps on the slopes of Cithaeron were abandoned. Forward scouts reported Greek columns moving south, apparently in disorder, some heading toward Plataea, others toward different positions. The intelligence was incomplete and contradictory, but the pattern was clear. The Greeks were retreating. The Persian general did not rush to judgment. He had campaigned long enough to know that apparent retreats could be traps. But as more reports came in, as cavalry scouts ranged across the abandoned Greek positions and found them truly empty, Mardonius allowed himself to believe what he was seeing. The Greeks had broken. The psychological pressure of the cavalry raids, the destruction of their water supply, the interception of their provisions, all of it had worked. They were running. Mardonius called for his officers. Orders were given rapidly. The army would advance immediately to pursue and destroy the retreating Greeks. There was no time for elaborate planning. The enemy was vulnerable and disorganized. This was the moment to strike before they could regroup. The Persian army began to move. The Immortals formed the core, 10,000 men in ordered ranks. The Median and Bactrian cavalry ranged ahead and on the flanks. Contingents from other parts of the empire followed, each under their own commanders, each bringing their own weapons and tactics. The army did not advance in a single organized mass. It moved as a collection of units, each following the enemy and seeking advantage. The pursuit was aggressive but not reckless. The Persians maintained some organization as they crossed the Asopus River and began to advance south across the plain. The cavalry moved fastest, racing ahead to locate the Greek forces and harass them. The infantry followed at a steady pace, not running but covering ground efficiently. What Mardonius saw as he observed from his vantage point appeared to confirm his assessment. Greek forces were scattered across several miles. Some were still moving, others had stopped in apparent confusion. There was no unified line of battle, no coordinated defensive position. The Greeks looked like an army in the process of disintegration. The Persian cavalry found the Spartans first. The Lacedaemonian column, still trying to reach the island position, was caught in the open ground south of the abandoned Greek camp. They were in marching order rather than battle formation, strung out along the line of march. The cavalry, seeing this vulnerability, attacked immediately. Arrows began to fall among the Spartan ranks. Men raised their shields, but in marching order, the phalanx's protective overlapping of shields was absent. The Spartans took casualties as they marched. Officers shouted orders to halt and form up, but the cavalry pressure made this difficult. Every time the column stopped, the arrow volleys intensified. Every time they tried to deploy into phalanx, the cavalry would shift position, attacking from a different angle. Pausanias understood that he had to find defensible ground and form his line there. Moving while under attack was costing lives without achieving anything. He looked around at the terrain and saw a low ridge with rocky slopes that would limit cavalry mobility. He ordered the column to make for that position. The Spartans moved toward the ridge at double time, still under constant harassment. Men were falling now, with increasing frequency. The helots carrying supplies and equipment began to break and run, fleeing toward Plataea in panic. Some of the lighter-armed perioikoi broke as well, but the Spartiate corps held together. They reached the ridge and began to deploy into formation. It was on this ridge, in broken ground, unsuitable for cavalry charges, that the Spartans finally turned to face their pursuers. The phalanx formed with the practiced efficiency of men who had drilled this maneuver thousands of times. Shields locked, spears came down. 8 ranks deep, the Spartan formation stood ready. The Persian cavalry, seeing the formed phalanx, pulled back to a safe distance. They continued to shoot arrows, but the Spartans had achieved what they needed: a moment to breathe, to organize, to prepare. The immediate crisis had passed, but the larger battle was only beginning. The Persian infantry arrives. Mardonius, observing the Spartan deployment from the plain, understood that the cavalry alone would not break this position. Arrows could harass and kill, but they could not dislodge a formed phalanx from defensible ground. He needed his infantry to engage and destroy the Spartan force before they could be reinforced by other Greek units. The Persian general ordered his best troops forward. The immortals advanced across the plain in loose formation, moving at a steady jog. They carried large wicker shields called sparabara, made of reeds woven tightly and capable of stopping arrows and light javelins. These shields could be planted in the ground to create a defensive wall, a tactic the Persians had perfected over generations of warfare. Behind the immortals came other infantry contingents: Medes, Bactrians, Sakai, troops from across the empire. The mass of men approaching the Spartan position numbered perhaps 40,000, though only a fraction would be able to engage at any given time due to the terrain. But the numbers still represented overwhelming force against the 5,000 Spartiates on the ridge. As the immortals came within range, they planted their shields and began to loose arrows. The volleys were dense and continuous. Thousands of arrows arced through the morning air and fell among the Spartan ranks. The Spartans raised their shields and endured. Men in the front ranks held their large aspis shields overhead and forward, creating a partial roof. Men in the rear ranks stepped closer, adding their shields to the coverage. Arrows thudded into bronze and wood. Most were stopped. Some found gaps. Men cried out and fell. The rear ranks stepped forward to fill the holes. The formation held but at a cost. The Spartans were bleeding. Pausanias knew he could not simply stand and absorb this punishment indefinitely. His men were disciplined enough to hold position while being shot at, but even Spartan discipline had limits. Men could only watch their comrades die around them for so long before something broke. He needed to either withdraw to better cover or advance and engage in close combat where Spartan advantages would tell. But the ritual demanded sacrifice first. Before any major engagement, before the moment when spears would clash and men would die in earnest, the gods had to be consulted. Pausanias called for a seer to perform the sacrifice. A goat was brought forward. The Spartan regent held the animal while the seer slit its throat and examined the organs, looking for signs of divine favor. The signs were unpropitious. The seer shook his head. The gods did not favor an attack at this moment. Pausanias, bound by religious law and personal piety, ordered the Spartans to hold position. They would wait. They would endure the arrow storm. They would trust in the gods. Another goat was brought forward. Another throat was slit. Another examination of entrails. Again, the signs were bad. The Spartans continued to stand, shields raised as arrows continued to fall. Men died. Blood pooled on the rocky ground. The helots behind the main line, armed with only light weapons and minimal armor, suffered even more. They had no heavy shields to protect them. They fell in greater numbers than the Spartiates, their bodies piling up as the volleys continued. The Tegeans, standing alongside the Spartans on the ridge, were growing restless. They could see the Spartans dying. They could feel the pressure building. Their own men were falling. One of the Tegean commanders looked at Pausanias and saw the Spartan regent standing immobile, tears streaming down his face, praying to the gods with his arms raised to the sky. The regent was not giving the order to advance. The Tegean commander made a decision. He could not watch his men die without responding. He gave the order for his contingent to charge. The Tegeans roared and began to advance down the slope toward the Persian line. The sacrifice accepted. The sight of the Tegeans charging broke the ritual. Paralysis. Pausanias, still waiting for divine approval, saw a third goat brought forward. The seer performed the sacrifice with practiced efficiency. The knife opened the animal's throat. The organs were examined. And this time, the signs were propitious. The gods had given their blessing. Pausanias raised his spear. He did not shout. He did not need to. The gesture was enough. The Spartans, who had been standing under fire for what felt like hours, but had probably been perhaps 30 minutes, began to move. The advance was not a mad rush. It was controlled, measured, inevitable. The front rank moved forward 3 steps. The second rank followed, maintaining exact intervals. The third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth ranks all stepped forward in perfect unison. The phalanx descended from the ridge like a bronze wave, shields locked, spears leveled, moving with mechanical precision. The Persians, who had been firing into a stationary target, suddenly faced an advancing wall of bronze. The immortals continued to shoot, but arrows were less effective against moving targets, and the Spartans were covering ground quickly now. The range closed, 300 yards, 200, 100. At 50 yards, the Spartans began to run. The walk became a jog, then a full sprint. The formation compressed as men in the rear ranks pushed forward, adding momentum and weight. The phalanx was no longer a line of individual warriors. It was a single entity, a battering ram of bronze and iron and human flesh, accelerating toward impact. The immortals braced themselves. They had faced charges before. They were professionals, veterans of numerous campaigns. They lowered their spears and prepared to receive the Spartan assault. The wicker shields were planted firmly. The men behind them gripped their weapons and waited. The collision was catastrophic. The front rank of the Spartan phalanx hit the Persian line with the combined momentum of 8 ranks of armored men. The wicker shields, tough and flexible enough to stop arrows, were not designed to stop this kind of impact. They shattered. The wooden frames splintered. Persian soldiers in the front rank were simply knocked backward, falling into the ranks behind them, creating a domino effect of collapsing men. Spartan spears punched through linen armor and scale mail. The dory, 8 feet of ash shaft tipped with iron, driven forward by the strength of a man who had trained for war his entire life, and the momentum of 7 more men pushing behind him, was unstoppable. Persian soldiers were impaled, the spearheads emerging from their backs, sometimes pinning 2 men together. The Spartans did not stop after the initial impact. They kept pushing. The entire formation drove forward, stepping over the bodies of the fallen, grinding into the Persian ranks. This was the othismos, the push, the fundamental tactic of hoplite warfare. It was less a fight than a physical contest, a shoving match with lethal weapons. The Persians tried to respond. They had courage, they had training, they had orders. The immortals in the second and third ranks pushed forward, trying to stabilize the line. They grabbed at Spartan spears with their bare hands, attempting to wrench them away or snap the shafts. Some succeeded. Spartan spears broke under the strain, but the men wielding those spears did not stop fighting. They dropped the broken shafts and drew their xiphos swords, short blades designed for exactly this kind of close combat. They continued to advance, stabbing over the tops of their shields, targeting throats and faces, the few areas of a man that remained vulnerable in the press of bodies. The Persians tried to stab back with their own short swords and daggers. They aimed for gaps in the Spartan armor, armpits, groins, the backs of knees. Sometimes they found these gaps. Sometimes Spartans fell. But the exchange was unequal. Persian weapons designed for flexibility and mobility were less effective in the crush. Their lighter armor, which allowed for greater speed and endurance, now became a liability. Spartan blades punched through linen and scale as if they were cloth. The psychological impact of the initial collision was as significant as the physical damage. The Persians had been shooting at the Spartans for an extended period. They had seen Spartans fall. They had believed, perhaps, that these Greek warriors were suffering, bleeding, weakening. And then suddenly the Greeks had charged, and the casualties they had inflicted seemed to have made no difference at all. The bronze wall had come forward as if unstoppable. The center of the Persian line began to buckle. Men in the rear ranks, unable to see what was happening at the front, but feeling the pressure, hearing the screams, seeing the wounded stumbling backward, began to edge away. Officers shouted orders, trying to hold the formation together. Some threatened deserters with death. But fear is contagious, and it was spreading through the Persian ranks faster than any order could contain it. The grinding advance. The battle became a meat grinder. The Spartans advanced foot by foot, the phalanx moving forward over the bodies of the dead and dying. The ground became slick with blood. Men slipped and stumbled. The wounded, unable to rise, were trampled by both sides. The Persians continued to fight with desperate courage. These were not conscripts or unwilling levies. The immortals were the elite of the Persian military. They had reputations to uphold and commanders watching. To flee would mean disgrace and likely execution. So they fought and they died. But courage without the right equipment and training was not enough. The hoplite phalanx was a system refined over centuries, designed to maximize the effectiveness of heavy infantry in close combat. The Persians were fighting individually, each man trying to survive and strike at the enemy. The Spartans were fighting as a unit, each man protecting his neighbor, the formation itself multiplying the effectiveness of each individual warrior. The Tegeans, who had charged slightly ahead of the Spartans, were engaged on the right flank. They were fighting equally fiercely, their own phalanx grinding forward through Median troops. The Tegean warriors were not Spartans, not products of the agoge, but they were experienced and well-trained hoplites. They understood the phalanx, they knew their role, and they were holding their part of the line. The battle lines were not straight. They were ragged, broken by the terrain and the chaos of combat. Units became separated or intermingled. Small groups of Persians found themselves isolated and surrounded. Small groups of Greeks found themselves cut off from their formations and had to fight their way back. But the overall pattern was clear. The Greeks were advancing. The Persians were giving ground. Mardonius, watching from his horse in the rear, saw his line beginning to collapse and understood that he had to act. If the immortals broke, if the best troops of the Persian army fled, the entire force would disintegrate. He gathered his personal guard, 1,000 picked men, and led them forward to shore up the line. The Persian general was not a man who commanded from safety. He rode a white horse, making himself conspicuous, making himself a target. He needed his men to see him, to know that he was sharing their danger. He plunged into the fighting, his guard around him, hacking at Greek warriors with his sword, rallying the immortals, trying to create a strong point that would hold. For a moment his intervention worked. The Persians around Mardonius, seeing their commander fighting beside them, found renewed courage. They pushed back against the Spartan advance. A small area of the line stabilized. Men who had been on the verge of fleeing instead held their ground. But the Spartans saw the white horse and the purple cloak of command. They understood what they were seeing. This was the Persian commander, the man responsible for burning Athens, the man who had remained in Greece to complete the conquest. If he could be killed, the battle would be over. The Spartan phalanx shifted its weight, angling toward Mardonius. The formation compressed, men packed tighter, shields overlapping more completely. They pushed forward with renewed intensity, not trying to advance along a broad front, but to drive a wedge toward the single point where the Persian general fought. The 1,000-man guard around Mardonius resisted fiercely. They knew their duty was to protect their commander with their lives. They formed a circle around the white horse, shields outward, fighting with the desperation of men who knew that failure meant not just death, but eternal dishonor. Persians fell in heaps around Mardonius, their bodies forming a rampart of flesh. But the Spartans kept coming. They stepped over the dead, pushed through the wounded, closed gaps in their own formation as men fell. The phalanx was relentless, mechanical, inhuman in its efficiency. It was not individuals fighting. It was a machine designed for killing, and it was functioning exactly as designed. A Spartan named Arimnestus, fighting in the front rank, saw an opening. Mardonius was leaning down from his horse, striking at a Greek warrior below him. For a moment his head and upper body were exposed. Arimnestus thrust his spear upward with all his strength. The spear point, already bloody from previous use, struck Mardonius in the head. Some accounts say it penetrated his helmet. Others say it hit him in the temple with such force that the skull shattered. The exact mechanism does not matter. The result was the same. The Persian general fell from his horse, dead or dying, and crashed to the ground. The 1,000 guards tried to protect the body. They fought with abandon, knowing that if they could not preserve their commander's corpse, they would face worse than death if they survived. But they were surrounded, outnumbered, exhausted. One by one they fell. The Spartans pushed forward, stepping over the bodies, converging on the spot where Mardonius had fallen. When the Persian troops further back saw the white horse without a rider, when word spread that Mardonius had been killed, the will to fight evaporated. These men were far from home. They were fighting for a commander who was now dead, for an empire that suddenly seemed distant and abstract. There was no shame in retreating now. There was only survival. The Persian line broke. It did not happen all at once or uniformly. Different units reached their breaking point at different moments. But once it began, the collapse spread rapidly. Men turned and ran. The organized retreat became a rout. The army that had advanced in formation across the plain was now a mob of individuals fleeing for their lives. Part 6. The rout. The transformation. The moment when a disciplined, military force becomes a fleeing mob is difficult to define, but unmistakable when it happens. One moment, men are standing in ranks, following orders, maintaining cohesion. The next moment, that cohesion has evaporated. Every man is alone, responsible only for his own survival, and the survival instinct demands flight. For the Persians, the transformation began with Mardonius's death and spread outward from that point like ripples on water. The immortals, having lost their general, and seeing the Spartans advancing relentlessly over the bodies of their comrades, started to fall back. The fall back became a retreat. The retreat became a run. The other Persian units, seeing the immortals flee, followed. If the elite troops could not hold, what chance did anyone else have? The cavalry, which had been harassing the Greek flanks, pulled back to avoid being caught in the collapse. The infantry from various provinces, many of whom had little personal stake in this campaign, broke formation and scattered. The Greeks saw the enemy running and understood that the critical moment had arrived. This was no longer a battle, it was a slaughter. And in ancient warfare, more men died in the rout than in the actual fighting. A man standing in formation, protected by his armor and his comrades, had a reasonable chance of survival even in defeat. A man running, his back exposed, his formation dissolved, was helpless prey. The Spartans did not pursue immediately. Their discipline held even in victory. Pausanias ordered the formation to halt and reorganize before advancing further. This was wise tactically. A pursuing force that breaks formation to chase fleeing enemies becomes vulnerable to counterattack. But it also meant that many Persians who might have been caught and killed in the immediate aftermath of the rout escaped the initial killing zone. Other Greek contingents were less disciplined. The Athenians, engaged with Persian troops on a different part of the battlefield, saw the enemy fleeing and gave chase. The Tegeans pursued as well. The smaller Greek contingents, finally released from the terror of standing under arrow fire, joined the hunt with enthusiasm. The Persians fled toward their fortified camp. Before the battle, they had constructed a large wooden stockade on the plain north of the Asopus River. This was not just a temporary camp, but a substantial fortification with walls, towers, and gates. It was designed to serve as a secure base of operations and a fallback position if needed. Now it became the focus of the Persian retreat. Thousands of men streamed toward the stockade, a panicked flood of humanity. Those who reached it first threw themselves through the gates. Those who arrived later found the gates closing as men inside tried to prevent the stockade from being overrun by the sheer press of bodies. The gates became choke points. Men fought each other to get inside, trampling the fallen, climbing over the bodies of their comrades. The Greeks reached the stockade soon after. They surrounded it, cutting off retreat routes and isolating the Persian force inside. But now the Greeks faced a problem. The Spartans were superlative in open battle, but they were not experienced at siege warfare. They did not have the equipment or expertise to assault fortified positions. The wooden walls, though hastily constructed, were high enough and strong enough to keep the Spartans at bay. The Persians inside the stockade, granted a brief reprieve, began to reorganize. Officers restored some degree of order. Troops were positioned along the walls. Arrows were distributed. The hope was that the fortification would allow them to hold out until the situation clarified, or until they could negotiate terms for withdrawal. But the Athenians were skilled at siege warfare. Athens had a long history of naval campaigns and amphibious assaults that required taking fortified positions. When the Athenian contingent arrived at the stockade, their commanders assessed the situation and began organizing an assault. The storming of the camp, the Athenian approach was methodical. They did not simply charge the walls. Instead, they identified weak points, places where the wooden palisade was less secure or where the ground allowed for easier approach. They brought up whatever tools were available: axes, hammers, crowbars. They organized assault teams with specific objectives. The first breach was achieved in the early afternoon. A section of the palisade, weakened by hasty construction and the pressure of men pushing against it from inside, gave way. The Athenians poured through the gap, expanding it, tearing down additional sections of wall. The Persians tried to hold the breach, but they were fighting uphill against momentum and numbers. Once the wall was breached in one location, the rest of the defenses became untenable. The Greeks could outflank defensive positions. They could attack from multiple directions. The neat rows of tents and supply wagons that filled the stockade became obstacles and hiding places for fleeing Persians, but also confined spaces where they could be cornered. What followed was not battle, but massacre. The Greeks moved through the camp systematically, killing everyone they encountered. There was no attempt to take prisoners. Prisoners were a burden, requiring guards and feeding. Prisoners might escape or be ransomed. Dead men were neither a burden nor a threat. The Persians inside the stockade had nowhere to run. The walls that were supposed to protect them now trapped them. Some tried to surrender, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. The Greeks killed them anyway. Some tried to hide among the tents and supplies. The Greeks burned sections of the camp to flush them out, then killed them as they emerged. Some fought to the end, selling their lives dearly. They died as well. The slaughter continued for hours. The Greeks were methodical, moving through the camp, section by section, ensuring no pockets of resistance remained. The ground became carpeted with bodies. The tents were soaked with blood, the air filled with smoke from fires and with the sounds of dying men. By late afternoon, the killing was done. The stockade had been completely overrun. Of the Persian force that had entered the fortification, only a tiny fraction survived. Ancient sources speak of only 3,000 Persians escaping the battle out of an army that had numbered perhaps 100,000. Even allowing for exaggeration, the casualties were staggering. An entire generation of Persian military manpower had been destroyed in a single day. The Greeks walked through the aftermath in something like shock. They had won, decisively and completely, but the scale of the killing was beyond what most had experienced or even imagined. The battlefield and the camp were scenes of carnage that defied description. Bodies lay in heaps. The wounded groaned and cried out, though there were precious few wounded. Most men had died. Blood pooled in the low spots and ran in rivulets down slopes. The Spartans, walking through this landscape of death, remained largely impassive. This was what they had been trained for. This was the culmination of the agoge, the purpose of all the discipline and hardship. They had done what they were supposed to do. They had destroyed the enemy. There was satisfaction in this, but it was cold satisfaction, the fulfillment of duty rather than the joy of victory. The few who escaped. Not all the Persians died at Plataea. A significant force under the command of Artabazus, second only to Mardonius in the Persian command structure, had not been fully engaged in the battle. Artabazus commanded perhaps 40,000 men, positioned as a reserve or perhaps as a separate force intended to operate independently. When Artabazus saw Mardonius fall and the Persian line collapse, he made a calculated decision. He did not order his troops to counterattack or to rally the fleeing soldiers. Instead, he ordered them to march away from the battlefield, not to retreat toward the stockade where they would be trapped, not to flee in panic, but to withdraw in good order, maintaining formation, moving north toward Thessaly and eventually toward the Hellespont and Asia. This was a cold-blooded abandonment of the rest of the Persian army. The men trapped in the stockade could have been relieved if Artabazus had intervened. The rout might have been stopped or at least slowed, but Artabazus understood that the battle was lost and that throwing more troops into the disaster would only increase Persian casualties without changing the outcome. His decision was pragmatic from a military standpoint. He preserved a substantial force that would eventually make it back to Asia intact. These troops could form the nucleus of future Persian operations, or at least defend Persian territory. But it was also a betrayal of the men he left behind. Those men died believing they had been abandoned by their own commanders, which in a sense they had been. The Greeks did not pursue Artabazus effectively. Their own forces were exhausted, disorganized by victory, and focused on the immediate task of securing the battlefield and the camp. By the time they realized that a large Persian force was escaping, Artabazus had too much of a head start. He marched rapidly, keeping his troops together, fighting off Greek contingents that tried to intercept him, and eventually reached Persian-controlled territory. But even Artabazus's escape was no comfort to Persia. He had saved 40,000 men, but lost perhaps 60,000 at Plataea. More importantly, he had lost the campaign. Greece would not be conquered. The invasion was over. The empire that had seemed unstoppable had been stopped. The casualties. When the killing finally ended and the Greeks had secured the battlefield, they began the grim task of counting the dead. Ancient battlefield accounting was imprecise at best, and the numbers reported by different sources vary widely. But even the most conservative modern estimates suggest that Persian casualties were catastrophic, while Greek losses were remarkably light. The Greeks had lost perhaps 1,500 men in total. Most of these were from the contingents that had been exposed to prolonged cavalry harassment or had been caught in disadvantageous positions during the confused night withdrawal. The Spartans themselves, despite bearing the brunt of the main battle, had lost only 91 citizens. This extraordinarily low number reflected both the effectiveness of their armor and training and the brief duration of the actual close combat once they had engaged. The Tegeans had suffered somewhat higher casualties, having charged slightly ahead of the Spartans and having been exposed to Persian fire for a longer period. The Athenians, engaged on a different part of the field, had lost several hundred men. The smaller contingents had varying losses depending on their positions and the intensity of combat they had faced, but these numbers paled beside the Persian losses. The most reliable ancient source, Herodotus, claims that of the entire Persian force, only 3,000 survived. Modern historians consider this an exaggeration, but even if we assume that perhaps 10 or 20,000 Persians escaped the battlefield through various means, the casualties were still overwhelming. The army that Mardonius had led into Boeotia had been effectively annihilated. The disproportion was not primarily due to Greek superiority in the actual fighting, though that was certainly a factor. It was due to the circumstances of the rout. When the Persian line broke and men began to flee, they became helpless. A hoplite phalanx, advancing against fleeing men, was like a harvesting machine moving through grain. The Persians, with their lighter armor and shorter weapons, could not turn and fight. Effectively, once they had broken formation, they could only run, and running men are easily killed. The stockade had been a trap. The men who fled there seeking protection found death instead. Confined within the wooden walls, unable to maneuver or escape, they had been slaughtered like animals in a pen. The Greeks had simply moved through the camp, killing everyone they found. The confined space meant there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. Every man inside the stockade had died, unless he was one of the fortunate few who managed to escape during the initial breach. The battlefield itself told the story in silent testimony. Bodies lay thickest where the Persian line had stood against the Spartan advance. Here, men had died in formation, trying to hold their ground, their corpses piled deep from the othismos and the grinding advance that followed. The immortals, the elite of the Persian military, had been decimated. The 1,000-man guard that had protected Mardonius lay dead. Around the spot where their commander had fallen, a circle of corpses marking their final stand. Further back, along the line of retreat toward the stockade, bodies were more scattered. These were men who had died running, struck down from behind as they fled. Arrows protruded from backs. Spear wounds pierced between shoulder blades. These were the deaths of panic and rout, undignified and brutal. Inside the stockade, the dead were piled so thick that walking through required climbing over corpses. The Greeks had killed without discrimination. Old men, young boys serving as camp followers, servants and slaves who had nothing to do with the fighting, all had been cut down. The Greeks were not interested in distinguishing combatants from non-combatants. Everyone in the Persian camp was an enemy. The plunder. Once the killing was done, the Greeks turned to plunder. The Persian camp contained wealth beyond anything most Greek soldiers had ever seen. Mardonius had been living in the Artsi tent that had belonged to Xerxes himself when the great king had been in Greece. This tent was palatial, more a portable building than anything recognizable as camping equipment. It was filled with furniture, inlaid with gold and silver, with silk hangings, with carpets from Persia and Egypt, with dining vessels of precious metals. The personal possessions of the Persian nobles who had died in the battle were equally valuable. Gold jewelry, inlaid weapons, fine clothing, all were stripped from the bodies and gathered into piles. The supply wagons contained not just military equipment, but luxuries intended to keep the Persian commanders comfortable: spices, wines, exotic foods, cosmetic oils. The Greeks divided the plunder according to established custom. A tenth was set aside as an offering to the gods, to be used to build temples and monuments, commemorating the victory. The rest was distributed among the various contingents proportional to their size and contribution. The Spartans, as the largest and most significant force, received the greatest share, but even the smallest contingents received enough to make their soldiers wealthy by Greek standards. One incident from the aftermath became famous in Greek tradition. Pausanias, walking through Mardonius's captured tent, saw the elaborate preparations that had been made for the Persian commander's dinner. The Persian cooks, who had survived by hiding, were commanded by the Spartan regent to prepare a meal exactly as they would have for Mardonius. They did so, laying out an elaborate feast with multiple courses, exotic seasonings, and fine wines. Then Pausanias ordered his own Spartan cooks to prepare a typical Spartan meal. They produced the black broth, a mixture of pork blood, vinegar, and salt, that was the staple of Spartan mess halls. The contrast between the two meals was stark. The Persian feast was elaborate, luxurious, a display of imperial wealth and sophistication. The Spartan meal was deliberately unappetizing, a rejection of luxury in favor of austerity. Pausanias invited the other Greek commanders to view both meals side by side. According to Herodotus, he laughed and said, "Men of Greece, I have brought you here to show you the folly of the Median commander, who, enjoying such fare as this, came here to rob us of our wretched meal." It was a moment of propaganda, a demonstration of the moral superiority of Greek simplicity over Persian decadence. The fact that the Greeks then proceeded to divide up the Persian wealth and take it home did not diminish the rhetorical power of the gesture. But there was a darker undertone to the plunder. The Greeks were taking not just treasure, but people. Persian women, the wives and concubines of nobles who had accompanied the army, became slaves. Children became slaves. Servants and craftsmen became slaves. These people would be sold in Greek markets or kept as property by the soldiers who had captured them. The battle had been a victory for Greek freedom, but that freedom was built on the enslavement of others. The bodies of the Persian dead were left where they lay. There was no attempt to bury them or honor them. Greek custom required that the dead be properly buried, but this courtesy did not extend to barbarians. The Persian corpses would be left for scavengers, for birds and dogs and insects. Within days, the battlefield would become a charnel ground, the smell of decay spreading for miles. The Greek dead were treated differently. Each contingent gathered its own fallen and prepared them for burial or cremation according to local custom. The Spartans burned their dead on pyres, collected the ashes, and eventually transported them back to Laconia for final burial. Monuments were erected on the battlefield itself, stone markers listing the names of those who had died. These monuments would stand for centuries, visible reminders of the day that Greece had defeated Persia. Part 7. Aftermath, the silence of. Mere victory. In the days following the battle, an unnatural quiet settled over the plain of Plataea. The clash of arms had ceased. The shouting and screaming had ended. What remained was silence broken only by the cries of scavengers and the occasional groan of a wounded man who had not yet died. The Greek army did not immediately disperse. The various contingents remained camped on and around the battlefield, partly to rest and recover, partly to complete the division of plunder, and partly because the sheer magnitude of what they had accomplished took time to process. They had faced the largest army ever assembled by the Persian Empire. They had been outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and pushed to the edge of defeat. And then, in a few hours of brutal combat, they had destroyed that army completely. Soldiers walked through the battlefield in small groups, speaking in low voices or not speaking at all. They looked at the piles of Persian dead and tried to comprehend the scale. They examined the abandoned Persian equipment, the wicker shields that had proven useless against bronze armor, the short spears that could not match the reach of Greek dories. They began to understand, perhaps for the first time, that the Persian military system was not invincible. It was simply different, and in this particular context, on this particular ground, inferior. The Spartans, characteristically, showed little outward emotion. They had done what they had been trained to do. The agoge had prepared them for exactly this. The years of hardship, the brutal discipline, the constant training, all of it had been vindicated. They had stood under arrow fire without breaking. They had charged when ordered. They had maintained formation throughout the combat. They had killed efficiently and without hesitation. This was what Sparta existed to produce, and the system had worked. But even among the Spartans, there was recognition that something significant had occurred. They had avenged Thermopylae. The 300 who had died in the pass could now rest, their sacrifice honored by this overwhelming victory. The Persian invasion of Greece was finished. The threat that had hung over the Hellenic world for a decade was ended. Sparta's reputation, tarnished by the absence at Marathon and the defeat at Thermopylae, was now restored and enhanced. They were again the undisputed military masters of Greece. The Athenians felt a different kind of satisfaction. They had won at Marathon a decade earlier, and they had won at Salamis the previous year. Now they had contributed to the decisive land victory at Plataea. Athens could claim, with justification, to have been at the forefront of Greek resistance throughout the Persian wars. The democratic system that had seemed chaotic and weak to oligarchic critics had proven capable of mobilizing and sustaining military effort. The Athenian contribution to Greek victory would not be forgotten, and it would shape Athenian politics and ambitions for generations. The smaller contingents, the Tegeans and Corinthians and Megarians and all the others, had their own reasons for satisfaction. They had been part of something larger than themselves. They had stood in the line. They had fought beside Spartans and Athenians as equals. The victory belonged to all of Greece, not just to the major powers. The men who survived Plataea would tell their children and grandchildren that they had been there, that they had fought, that they had helped save Greece from conquest. The strategic implications Plataea was not just a tactical victory. It was a strategic turning point that ended any realistic possibility of Persian conquest of mainland Greece. The defeat did not destroy the Persian Empire, which remained vast and powerful and would continue to exist for another century and a half. But it did convince the Persians that Greece was not worth the cost of continued military effort. Xerxes, who had withdrawn after Salamis, was still in Asia Minor when news of Plataea reached him. The loss of Mardonius was personal. He had been Xerxes' brother-in-law and trusted commander. The loss of the army was professional. It represented years of preparation and enormous expenditure of resources. The strategic loss was even greater. With both the navy and the army defeated, there was no practical way to renew the invasion in the near term. The Persian Empire was not a monolithic military dictatorship. It was a complex administrative structure managing dozens of different peoples and territories. Revolts were common. Border regions required constant military attention. The empire had enemies in every direction. Committing massive resources to conquering Greece had been justified by the expectation of relatively easy victory and substantial rewards. Now that the cost had proven high and the victory elusive, other priorities reasserted themselves. Moreover, Plataea had damaged Persian prestige. The empire's power rested partly on the perception that resistance was futile. Provincial governors and client states cooperated with Persian authority because they believed the empire was invincible. The defeats at Salamis and Plataea challenged that perception. If the Greeks could defeat the great king's armies, perhaps others could as well. The psychological impact rippled through the empire, making governance more difficult and rebellion more likely. For Greece, the victory opened new possibilities. With the immediate threat ended, the the Greek city-states could turn their attention to other matters. Athens, in particular, would use its naval superiority to build an empire of its own, transforming the Delian League from a defensive alliance against Persia into an instrument of Athenian hegemony. Sparta would struggle with the question of whether to remain engaged beyond the Peloponnese or to return to its traditional focus on internal control. The alliance that had won at Plataea would not long survive the victory. Within a few years, Athens and Sparta would become rivals, eventually fighting the Peloponnesian War that would consume Greece for nearly 3 decades. But that was in the future. For now, in the immediate aftermath of Plataea, there was unity born of shared triumph. The counting and the monuments. In the weeks after the battle, the Greeks conducted a more careful accounting of what had been accomplished. The plunder was inventoried. The Persian camp had yielded an enormous quantity of wealth: gold and silver vessels, jewelry, fine fabrics, exotic spices, weapons inlaid with precious metals. The total value was impossible to calculate precisely, but it represented a windfall that would enrich Greek temples and treasuries for years. 1/10 of the plunder was set aside for Apollo's temple at Delphi, as was customary after major victories. This would be used to create a monument to the victory, a permanent reminder of the day that Greece had defeated Persia. Other portions were allocated to temples at Olympia and the Isthmus of Corinth. The gods had to be thanked for their favor, and thanksgiving took the form of lavish dedications. The remainder was distributed among the various Greek contingents. The Spartans received the largest share, reflecting both their numbers and their decisive contribution to the victory. But even the smallest contingents received enough to make the campaign profitable for their cities. The soldiers themselves, particularly those who had been among the first to enter the Persian camp and claim personal plunder, returned home as wealthy men by the standards of their communities. But wealth was not the most important result of the victory. The real value lay in security and confidence. Greek cities could now rebuild without fear of immediate Persian attack. Farmers could plant crops knowing they would be able to harvest them. Merchants could trade without worrying that their cargoes would be seized by Persian naval raids. The psychological burden that had weighed on Greece since Marathon was lifted. Monuments were erected at various locations to commemorate the victory. At Plataea itself, a stone altar was built to Zeus the Liberator, marking the spot where the Greeks had been freed from the threat of Persian conquest. The names of all the cities that had contributed forces to the battle were inscribed on a bronze column in the shape of 3 intertwined serpents, which was later moved to Constantinople and portions of which still exist today. Individual states erected their own monuments. Sparta built a memorial at home listing the names of the Spartiates who had fallen. Athens dedicated trophies and weapons in temples. The smaller cities recorded their participation in local inscriptions, ensuring that future generations would know that their ancestors had fought at Plataea. These monuments served multiple purposes. They honored the dead and thanked the gods. They provided a record for posterity, but they also made political statements. The placement of names, the prominence given to different cities, the language used to describe the battle, all of these were carefully negotiated. The monuments were not neutral records, but contested narratives, each state trying to ensure that its contribution was properly recognized. The most significant monument was also the simplest. On the battlefield itself, the Greeks erected a stone marker that read, in plain language, "Here the Greeks stood against the Persians and won." No elaborate description, no detailed accounting of tactics or casualties, just the bare fact of victory, stated simply and without embellishment. That monument, more than any of the elaborate dedications in temples, captured the essence of what had occurred at Plataea. Part 8. Why Plataea Mattered, the end of imperial ambition. Plataea marked the end of active Persian attempts to conquer mainland Greece. The empire would continue to interfere in Greek affairs through diplomacy and bribery, supporting one city-state against another to prevent any unified Greek threat. Persian gold would flow into Greece for decades, funding wars between Greek states and ensuring that Greece remained divided. But there would be no more massive invasions, no more attempts at outright conquest. The reason was simple. The cost had proven too high and the benefit too uncertain. The Persian Empire was vast, stretching from the borders of India to the Mediterranean. Managing this territory required constant military effort. Resources were limited, even for an empire. The failed invasions of Greece had consumed enormous quantities of men, ships, and treasure. They had produced embarrassing defeats that damaged Persian prestige. From the Persian perspective, Greece was a peripheral concern. The Greek city-states were quarrelsome, politically unstable, and not particularly wealthy by imperial standards. They controlled no vital trade routes that the decisive Persians could not bypass. They posed no direct military threat to Persian core territories. Conquering them would have been satisfying, particularly given the history of Greek interference in the Ionian Revolt. But it was not necessary. The Persian Empire made a calculated decision to write off Greece as too difficult and too costly to conquer. This decision was not made in a single moment, but evolved over the years following Plataea, as the empire focused on other priorities. Egypt revolted and had to be reconquered. Border regions in Central Asia required constant attention. Internal power struggles consumed the attention of Persian leadership. Greece, despite the defeats it had inflicted, was simply not important enough to justify the resources needed to try again. This had profound consequences for the development of Western civilization. Had Persia succeeded in conquering Greece, the entire trajectory of European history would have been different. There would have been no Athenian Golden Age, no flourishing of philosophy and drama. The democratic experiments that began in Athens would have been stillborn. The cultural heritage that Rome would later absorb and transmit to medieval Europe would not have existed in the same form. Instead, Greece was free to develop independently. Athens became a cultural powerhouse, producing Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and countless others who shaped Western thought. Sparta continued its strange experiment in social engineering until it eventually failed. The smaller city-states pursued their own paths. Greek culture spread through trade and colonization, creating a Hellenic world that stretched from Spain to the Black Sea. All of this was possible because of Plataea. The battle did not guarantee Greek success or prevent future disasters. The Peloponnesian War would nearly destroy Greek civilization through internecine conflict. Macedonia would eventually conquer and unify Greece. Rome would later absorb the entire Greek world into its empire. But these were developments driven by Greek and European dynamics, not by Persian conquest. The Greek world was shaped by Greeks, for better or worse, because Plataea had ended the Persian threat, the Spartan zenith. For Sparta specifically, Plataea represented the peak of its power and reputation. The city-state that had sent 300 men to die at Thermopylae had redeemed that sacrifice with overwhelming victory. The Spartan military system, with all its brutality and rigidity, had proven its effectiveness. The hoplite phalanx, refined and perfected in Laconia, had demonstrated its superiority over the more flexible but less heavily equipped Persian forces. Sparta's leadership of the Greek alliance against Persia was confirmed. While Athens had contributed decisively at Marathon and Salamis, Plataea was primarily a Spartan victory. The 5,000 Spartiates had formed the core of the Greek army. They had held position under arrow fire with discipline that amazed even their allies. They had charged when ordered and had ground through the Persian lines with mechanical efficiency. They had killed the Persian commander and routed his army. No one could question Spartan military supremacy after Plataea. This recognition brought Sparta political influence throughout Greece. Other states looked to Sparta for military leadership. Sparta's alliance system, the Peloponnesian League, became the dominant power bloc in Greece. Spartan opinions on military and foreign policy matters carried weight. For a few decades after Plataea, Sparta was the undisputed hegemon of Greece, but this position of dominance also brought problems. Sparta's system was designed for internal control and defensive warfare, not for managing an empire or projecting power across the Mediterranean. The constant need to keep the helots subdued meant that Sparta was reluctant to send large forces far from home. The rigid conservatism that made Spartan soldiers so effective also made Spartan policy inflexible and unable to adapt to changing circumstances. Athens, meanwhile, was building naval power and commercial wealth. The Athenian Empire grew through different methods than Sparta's alliance system. Athens demanded tribute, imposed democratic governments on subject states, and used its navy to enforce compliance. It was more intrusive and more exploitative than Sparta's approach, but it was also more profitable and more effective at projecting power. The rivalry between these two systems, between Spartan land power and Athenian sea power, between oligarchy and democracy, would define Greek politics for the next several decades. Plataea had established Sparta's military preeminence, but it had not resolved the fundamental question of what kind of power would dominate Greece. That question would only be answered through the Peloponnesian War, which Sparta would eventually win, but at a cost that left it fatally weakened. So Plataea was simultaneously Sparta's greatest triumph and the beginning of its long decline. The victory had been so complete, the demonstration of Spartan military skill so overwhelming, that it seemed to validate everything about the Spartan system. This validation made reform impossible. Why change a system that had just won the most important battle in Greek history? But the world was changing, and a system that could not change with it was doomed to eventual failure. The nature of discipline. Plataea demonstrated something fundamental about military organization and combat effectiveness that remains relevant to this day. It showed that discipline, training, and cohesion can multiply the effectiveness of individual soldiers far beyond what their numbers would suggest. The 5,000 Spartiates who held the line against tens of thousands of Persians did so not because they were physically superior, but because they functioned as a unit rather than as individuals. Every aspect of the Spartan system was designed to create this cohesion. The agoge took boys from their families at age 7 and raised them communally, ensuring that their primary loyalty was to their age mates and to Sparta, rather than to family. The syssitia, the mess groups where Spartan men ate together throughout their adult lives, reinforced these bonds. The constant training drilled into each man the precise movements and responses needed to function within the phalanx. The brutal punishment of cowardice or failure ensured that no man would break formation and endanger his comrades. The result was an army that could execute complex maneuvers with precision, that could stand under fire without breaking, that could maintain formation while advancing over rough ground and through enemy resistance. This was not a mob of brave individuals. It was a machine, and machines do not panic or rout or lose cohesion when things become difficult. The Persians, despite having many brave and skilled warriors, did not have this level of systemic cohesion. Their army was composed of units from different parts of the empire, speaking different languages, following different commanders, trained in different methods. This diversity gave the Persian army flexibility and the ability to deploy multiple tactical approaches. But it also meant that when the line broke, it broke completely. There was no underlying cohesion to prevent rout once fear began to spread. Modern military organizations understand this principle. Elite units like special forces or marine divisions spend enormous resources on training and cohesion, precisely because these factors multiply combat effectiveness. The goal is to create units that function as Spartan formations did, as integrated wholes where each member trusts every other member completely and where discipline holds even under extreme stress. But the Spartan example also shows the limitations of this approach. The same discipline that made Spartans effective soldiers also made them inflexible. They were trained to fight in one way, the phalanx, and struggled when circumstances required different tactics. They were trained to obey orders without question, which made them poor at independent decision-making when separated from their commanders. They were trained to suppress individual thought and initiative, which meant they produced few innovative strategists. The ideal, which no society has fully achieved, would be to combine Spartan discipline with Athenian flexibility, to create soldiers who could function as a coordinated unit when needed, but could also think independently and adapt to unexpected circumstances. This tension between unity and flexibility, between discipline and initiative, remains central to military thinking. The myth and the reality. In the centuries following Plataea, the battle became mythologized. Greek and later Roman writers depicted it as a clash between freedom and tyranny, between West and East, between civilization and barbarism. The Spartans in particular were idealized as perfect warriors, men who cared nothing for personal safety and everything for honor and duty. This mythological version of Plataea obscures as much as it reveals. The reality was more complex and more interesting than the myth. The Greeks who fought at Plataea were not perfect heroes. They were men with all the flaws and virtues of humanity. Some were brave, some were cowardly, some fought for glory, some fought because they had no choice, some committed atrocities during the sack of the Persian camp, some showed mercy. The Spartans in particular were not the noble warriors of legend. They were products of a brutal system that oppressed helots, murdered potential leaders among the enslaved population, and trained boys through methods that would be considered child abuse in any modern society. Their military effectiveness came at enormous human cost, paid not just by the Spartans themselves, but by the thousands of helots who worked the fields and served as light infantry and who had no voice and no freedom. The Persians were not the tyrannical barbarians of Greek propaganda. They were soldiers following orders, fighting for an empire that gave many of its subjects prosperity and protection. The Persian Empire was more tolerant of ethnic and religious diversity than most Greek city-states. It had sophisticated administration, advanced engineering, and a cosmopolitan culture. Its defeat at Plataea was not a victory of civilization over barbarism, but the failure of one military system against another in specific circumstances. But myths serve purposes that reality cannot. The myth of Plataea inspired later generations of Greeks to resist foreign domination. It provided a narrative of unity and courage that helped forge Greek identity. It gave Sparta a reputation that would last long after its actual power had faded, and it contributed to Western culture's ongoing fascination with the idea of the citizen soldier, the free man defending his homeland against invaders. The challenge for historians is to appreciate both the myth and the reality, to understand why the myth was created and what purposes it served, while also examining the actual events with clear eyes. Plataea was an important battle that shaped history, but it was not the simple morality tale that later ages made it. It was complex, morally ambiguous, and ultimately human. Conclusion: the silence after the storm. The battlefield at Plataea fell silent in the days and weeks after the fighting. The last of the wounded had died or been carried away. The Greek army had dispersed, each contingent marching home with its share of plunder and its stories of glory. The Persian dead remained where they had fallen, their bodies slowly returning to the earth. In time, grass would grow over the blood-stained ground. Farmers would return to their fields. The plain would again be used for cultivation rather than combat. The monuments erected by the Greeks would stand for centuries, but eventually even they would crumble or be carted away for building materials. The battle would pass from living memory into history and finally into legend. But in that moment, immediately after the fighting ceased, there was just silence. The silence that follows extreme violence, the silence of exhaustion, the silence of men trying to process what they had witnessed and done. 200 Spartan warriors, the core of the larger Spartan force, had stood at the critical point when the Persian line charged. They had held formation under arrow fire. They had waited with inhuman patience for orders while men died around them. And then they had advanced with mechanical precision, closing with the enemy, engaging in the brutal work of close combat, and finally breaking through to kill the Persian commander. Those 200, along with their comrades, had killed perhaps 6,000 Persians in the immediate vicinity of their advance. The total Persian dead, when the entire battlefield was accounted for, numbered tens of thousands. The disproportion was staggering. It spoke to the effectiveness of Greek armor and tactics, to the advantage of fighting on chosen ground, to the devastating consequences of rout and pursuit. But it also spoke to the nature of ancient warfare, where casualties in victory were light and casualties in defeat were catastrophic. The side that held the field after battle lost perhaps 10% of its force. The side that broke and ran might lose half or more. Plataea exemplified this pattern in its most extreme form. The Greeks had won a complete victory. They had destroyed the Persian army. They had ended the invasion. They had secured their freedom. But they had also created a charnel ground, a place of mass death, where thousands of men had been killed in a few hours of fighting and pursuit. This was the reality of their triumph, and it was both glorious and terrible. Sparta, having proven its system at Plataea, would continue on its course for another century and a half. The agoge would keep producing soldiers. The helots would keep working the fields under threat of violence. The rigid social structure would remain unchanged. But eventually, the system's contradictions would become unsustainable. Demographic collapse would reduce the citizen population below viable levels. Military defeat at Leuctra would shatter the myth of invincibility. The liberation of Messenia would destroy the economic foundation, and Sparta would fade into irrelevance, remembered primarily for Thermopylae and Plataea rather than for anything it achieved afterward. The Persians, having failed to conquer Greece, would turn their attention elsewhere. The empire would endure for another 150 years until Alexander of Macedon would conquer it. But Persia's historical trajectory had been altered at Plataea. The easy expansion westward was no longer possible. The Mediterranean would remain contested ground rather than Persian territory, and European history would develop independently rather than as part of a Persian imperial system. Greece itself would enjoy a brief period of unity and triumph before descending into the Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta, allies at Plataea, would become mortal enemies. The Greek city-states would exhaust themselves in fratricidal conflict, eventually becoming so weakened that Macedon could conquer them. But that future tragedy was still decades away. For now, in the immediate aftermath of Plataea, Greece was united, victorious, and free. 200 Spartans and their comrades had slaughtered 6,000 Persians and routed tens of thousands more. They had done what they were designed to do. They had fought as a unit, maintained discipline under pressure, and executed their tactical role with devastating efficiency. The battle was a vindication of everything the Spartan system claimed to produce. But it was also a demonstration of the limits of such systems. The Spartans had won the battle, but they had not won the peace. They had defeated the Persians, but they could not defeat their own internal contradictions. They had proven themselves on the battlefield at Plataea, but they would ultimately fail in the longer contest of building a sustainable civilization. The silence that fell over Plataea after the battle was the silence of ending. It was the end of the Persian invasion. It was the end of Greek unity. It was the peak of Spartan power, the moment after which everything would be decline. But none of this was clear in that moment. The Greeks who walked through the battlefield saw only victory. They saw Persian bodies. They saw abandoned equipment. They saw wealth beyond their dreams in the captured camp. They believed they had won decisively and permanently. And in a sense, they had. Greece would remain free. The threat that had haunted the Greek world for a decade was ended. The battle would become legend, inspiring future generations. But the cost of that victory, the brutality required to achieve it, the system that produced warriors capable of such efficient killing, those would cast long shadows over Greek history. Plataea was a slaughter. It was efficient, professional, devastating. 200 Spartans, supported by thousands of allies, had destroyed a Persian army many times their number. It was one of history's most lopsided victories, achieved through superior equipment, tactics, and discipline. It was also a human tragedy on an enormous scale, where thousands died in terror and pain, where the wounded were trampled and the fleeing were cut down without mercy. This is the reality that the legend obscures, but that history must remember. Plataea was both glorious and horrifying, both inspiring and cautionary. It showed what disciplined soldiers could achieve. It also showed what they could become. The lesson, if there is one, is that military excellence alone is not enough. Sparta won at Plataea, but lost in the longer contest of history. The 200 who slaughtered 6,000 were products of a system that was simultaneously magnificent and monstrous. The silence after the battle contained all of this: victory and defeat, glory and shame, the beginning and the end. It was the silence of completion, of a task fulfilled, of a story that would be told for thousands of years. And it was the silence of aftermath, when the killing stops and men are left to contemplate what they have done and what it means. Plataea decided the Persian wars, but it could not decide the future of Greece or Sparta. Those decisions would be made in the decades and centuries that followed, shaped by the victory but not determined by it. The battle was an ending, but it was also a beginning, a moment that would echo through history, interpreted and reinterpreted by each succeeding generation. And in that silence, on that blood-stained ground, with the bodies of thousands lying under the summer sun, the Greeks stood victorious. They had defended their homes. They had honored their dead. They had proven their worth as warriors. What they would do with that victory, how they would use the freedom they had won, those questions remained unanswered. The battle was over. The war was over. But the story was just beginning.